Where are we?
Between light and shadow.
We all have idols, people from the past or even the present that encourage us, that inspire us, athletes or actors or writers whose lives we admire, even envy. These towering figures loom large in our wide, awestruck eyes, so it's a bit strange to consider the fact that they almost certainly had idols of their own before they achieved, well, whatever it is they achieved to make us idolize them in the first place. No one exists in a vacuum. Legends are born beneath the shadows of legends that came before them. Hey kids, it's Craig, and this is Between Light and Shadow, a Twilight Zone podcast. Rod Serling has been an idol of mine since I first discovered the Twilight Zone 35 years ago. And one of his idols was one Mr. Norman Corwin. Some of you younger listeners may have no idea who Norman Corwin was. So for a quick introduction to the man, we'll consult, you know. Norman Lewis Corwin was an American writer, screenwriter, producer, essayist, and teacher of journalism and writing. His earliest and biggest successes were in the writing and directing of radio drama during the 1930s and 1940s. Corwin was among the first producers to regularly use entertainment, even light entertainment, to tackle serious social issues. In this area, he was a peer of Orson Welles and William N. Robeson, and an inspiration to other later radio and TV writers, such as Rod Serling, Gene Roddenberry, Norman Lear, J. Michael Straczynski, and Yuri Rosofsky.
We hold these truths.
This is a program about the making of a promise and the keeping of a promise. This is a program about the rights of people. This is a program coming to you over the combined radio networks of the United States, bringing you the voices of Americans, bringing you the voice of the President of the United States. This is a program for listeners in all zones of continental time, for listeners on ships away from home, for listeners in uniform, for listeners on the American islands, in the two great oceans. This is a program about the guarantee made to the people of America 150 years ago. A guarantee that has been kept through peace and war and peace and war. A guarantee we call the Bill of Rights.
In December 1941, he created a program to commemorate the 150th anniversary of the United States Bill of Rights. We Hold These Truths was first broadcast on December 15, 1941. Corwin said it was written at the invitation of the U.S. Office of Facts and Figures. He recalled being on a train on his way to California to produce the program when news of the attack on Pearl Harbor came to him. He sent a telegram to Washington at the next stop, asking if the OFF still wanted the program done. When he got to Albuquerque, a telegram was waiting for him. The president says, now more than ever. Many radio and movie stars of the day featured, along with an epilogue by President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. With an audience of 60 million listeners, it became one of the most famous ever produced on radio. In 1941, he received a Peabody Award for that program. Now, 1941 had already been a big year for Corwin. Since 1938, he'd been both a writer and director for the Columbia Workshop, but starting in May of 41, the entire series was handed over to him for an unprecedented 26-week-long string of dramas written exclusively by him. This led to a spin-off devoted exclusively to him, Columbia Presents Corwin, which premiered in 1944 and ran for 30 weeks. Corwin wrote and directed all 30 episodes, and one of those episodes is our focus tonight. But we'll come back to that in a bit. It's not hard to see how Serling could idolize Corwin. Both were Jewish, both were politically liberal, and both were keenly aware of the potential greatness of mankind and the inherent weaknesses that kept that greatness always on the horizon and never in hand. In his novel Serling, The Rise and Twilight of Television's Last Angry Man, Gordon F. Sander describes their similarities and differences. After he had abandoned radio for television and Serling and Corwin had become friends, Serling readily acknowledged Corwin's great influence on him. Upon inspection, the connections are clear enough. Serling's mordant Twilight Zone lead-ins, his love for the common man, the parable-like quality of much of his later writing, the sophisticated sound effects, and the occasionally purple prose, the cautiously optimistic worldview, all these aspects of Serling's work have their antecedents in the works of Corwin. One crucial difference. Corwin disliked controversy. Serling thrived on it. Corwin himself would be typically gracious in comparing his golden moment with Serling's. Rod's achievement was much more striking than mine. He was operating during the McCarthy period. He was swimming against the tide. I had the freedom. I had the creativity. I had the ambiance. He didn't. On July 18, 1944, week 18 of the 30-week Columbia Presents Corwin series, CBS premiered The Moat Farm Murder, which Corwin had adapted from an actual transcript of a murder trial in 1903 England. Charles Laughton read the chilling account by Samuel Dougal, who was being prosecuted for the murder of his lover, Camille Holland. As he had done for many CBS radio productions, Bernard Herrmann provided an original music score which, 16 years later, would be heard on network television for the first time on The Twilight Zone. And it's this particular score that we're focusing on here. And if we're gonna talk about music...
Music, Professor!
That's right. She's got her own jingle now. She sure as hell deserves one, right? Folks, Dr. Reba Wissner.
Hello.
Hey, Doc.
Oh, God, it's you.
You know, I actually get that a lot. So I'm not offended because I'm used to that kind of abuse. It's been a while. I think the last time we actually talked was around the holidays.
Something like that, yeah.
You forcibly took over the podcast briefly since then, but I was not in that episode.
No.
So here we are.
Indeed.
The podcast is back. We'll see how long it survives this time. Yes, this is exciting. We have a number of cool things cooked up, you and I.
Yes, we do.
I'm excited. Not necessarily right now, but down the road. There's a couple things I'm really excited about. And I'm just going to throw out there right now, I'm going to commit to it on the air. We're going to do an Outer Limits special episode.
Yeah.
In a few months. And definitely you're going to be part of that because you wrote the book on the music. So
Awesome sauce.
Yes, we got to get our buddy Dave Scow involved with that too.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah, we do.
A giant
All
party.
right.
The monster party.
Monster party. Yes. I don't see why not. All right, so we are talking about the Moat Farm Murder. Before I called you, I mentioned that I just gave a little background on the radio drama, some stuff about Norman Corwin. Then I just slyly segued into the fact that the music was Bernard Herrmann and that it subsequently landed in the CBS Music Library. What else can you tell us about that?
Well, if you've not heard the radio play, it is some creepy stuff, which was perfect for the CBS library, especially when it was reused in the Twilight Zone, because hence a lot of creepy stuff happens. And the music editors were actually really strategic about where they reused all of the cues, but especially the ones for Moat Farm Murder. They are splattered all over or around the Twilight Zone. And the most frequently used one is really not even a whole cue, it's really a stinger. It's the stinger that you hear when Alan Talbot in his image is pulling back his skin. It's the stinger that you hear when Oliver Kringle is revealed to be 2 feet tall in 4 o'clock. And most famously, it's the stinger that you hear when poor Bob Wilson pulls back the curtain in Nightmare at 20,000 Feet and sees that ugly-looking gremlin, although he's probably not ugly-looking to his mother, but ugly-looking gremlin peeking through the window.
You know, it's so funny. So this is kind of a supplement episode to this week's, I don't want to say actual episode because that makes it sound like this episode is less important, and it's not. But we covered the Rip Van Winkle caper, which kind of leads us here. And I actually talked a little bit about the stinger cue over there, and I said really basically exactly what you just said. And I used the same 3 examples.
You know what the problem is? We share a brain, but we can sit far apart. And in our case, sitting far apart means on opposite ends of the country. Right,
exactly. This is true. That's just funny because I know it shows up in other places, but those were the 3 that really popped in my head as far as maybe the most iconic uses of that. But it's other places too. And right now I'm trying to rack my brain where else is it? The Egyptian, the scarab thing.
Yes, in Queen of the Nile.
Yes, yeah.
I believe it's at the moment in which the poor guy disintegrates into a skeleton, and you just see the scarab on his bony ribs.
Yeah. I think the reason that I remember that one is because here in Portland, when I first saw the show airing in syndication here in the early 80s, they would, have they'd put together little commercials. So they'd use different clips from different things. And I remember that one was part of that. One of those promos was that shot of him turning into a skeleton and that stinger cue.
It's funny because out of the Twilight Zone stingers, there are really 2 stingers that constantly come back. One is the one from Moat Farm Murder. And the other one is actually one from a show called House on K Street. And that one is the one where, if you look at one for the Angels, where Mr. Death reveals himself, every time he kind of reveals himself, he goes, duh! That's the stinger from House on K Street. So those are the 2 stingers that are constantly used over and over and over again.
So Herrmann does the music for the Moat Farm Murder, and at this time, I mean, we're in the early to mid 40s. He's doing predominantly radio stuff. He's done a few films. Obviously, he did Citizen Kane, The Magnificent Ambersons. Let's see. I think Jane Eyre happened before. Maybe before this.
Possibly,
No.
I don't know the offhand.
Huh. And I used to be a Herrmann expert, and I don't know. I got older and lost a lot of brain cells.
Mine is the first go.
But he'd done a few things, a few films, high profile stuff. But he still predominantly was doing radio stuff, a lot of stuff on CBS. I don't think he was the only composer that did music for the various iterations of the Norman Corwin stuff. But I know that he was kind of there for a lot of it, and we know that he had already done the Hitchhiker score. So he does the Moat Farm Murder, and like so much of his radio stuff, it ends up later being added to the CBS Music Library.
Right.
But I also know that a lot of he re-recorded a lot of it, right?
He did.
Like, so the cues that we hear in the Twilight Zone are not the identical recordings that you hear in the radio play.
No, I believe those were re-recorded. Some were re-recorded for the radio shows, and some were not. And I believe the ones from Moat Farm Murder were re-recorded, but I'm not completely entirely sure.
Okay. So you sent me something that you had written.
Yes. I actually talked about this in I believe it was 2014 at the American Musicological Society National Conference. And I put a very kind of clever montage together of Q5, I believe, and Q9 from Moat Farm and all of the ways it shows up in the Twilight Zone. And I also forgot to give a kind of like, this is not for the weak kind of premise, so that when you get that stinger where Alan Talbot is peeling his skin off, you see everybody in the room cringing. But what's funny about it is that when I gave my talk at Ithaca, when I was invited to give the talk, the person who invited me actually invited me because they were at that paper. And they loved the montages, and they loved like the way I was talking about things. So it's really that Moat Farm Murder study that got me invited to Ithaca. But everyone always said that was a lot of fun to see all of the same music back to back with different images and how they played around with it.
So maybe just clarify for me this paper that you sent me.
Yes.
Is this basically just in written form what you just described, or
it is it is currently being reviewed for a journal. I'm waiting to hear back on that. Hopefully at some point it will see the light of day in publication. It has been under review for approximately 1 year and 6 months, which is kind of par for the course for academic journals. So we'll see what happens with that. But yes, I mean, that is pretty much the fleshed out version of my 30-minute talk.
Okay. So the Rip Van Winkle caper, by far, I think, uses the most of the Moat Farm Murder cues of any Twilight Zone episode.
Yes.
And like I talked about over in the other episode, when I was cruelly comparing that episode with I Shot an Arrow into the Air, I fear that this totally came off as a diss against that episode's stock music because I basically said, it's fine. It's just kind of, it's not necessarily as memorable because you've got like multiple different composers. So you've got all these, it's kind of like this patchwork of different cues. Whereas Rip Van Winkle caper, it's almost all Moat Farm, so it's very cohesive.
Right.
And
the other thing I think also has to do with the actual play for Moat Farm, because there's this guy who, I don't know if you talked about the synopsis at all, but there's this guy who is moving in with this wealthy widow and decides that he's going to kill her for her money. And in a lot of ways, it's very similar to what happens in the Rip Van Winkle paper, where Farwell gets very greedy and decides to kill the people he was with to try and get all of the gold.
And there's a lot of that kind of foresight on the part of, I'm going to blank on his name, whoever was responsible for choosing the stock music. Was it Led Gluskin?
It was, but also they had different music supervisors who would basically work under Gluskin and choose whatever they wanted. So Robert Drasnin did a few, and there are others that are not credited, so I don't know exactly who did it. In fact, watching the marathon this past weekend, I actually wound up noticing two really clever cue releases. And when I went back to try and track down the name of the music supervisor for that episode, I couldn't. So some people, like Robert Drasnin, was very open about the ones that he was music supervisor for, but not all of them were. So I don't quite know who was the music supervisor for Rip Van Winkle.
And correct me if I'm wrong, but didn't you actually have some contact with Robert Drasnin for your book?
I did. I tried getting in touch with him for about a year. And finally I resorted to the whole, let me just try writing him a letter. And
That's so old school.
6 months later, I get this random envelope, and it actually just happened to be the day before my birthday. And it was a 3-page handwritten letter from Robert Drasnin.
Oh my gosh.
Answering all of my questions, and it was like the best birthday present ever.
Oh, that's so cool.
The year that I wound up getting color manuscripts for the opera I was writing on my dissertation, which is many years ago. But yeah, it was amazing because not only did he answer my questions, but he also actually mentioned a couple of things about the 80s version, which I didn't ask him about. So that's really kind of cool. And unfortunately, he passed away not very long after I had contact with him. But I did send him a copy of my book when it was out. So
nice.
I autographed it for him and thanked him.
I was going to say, did you sign it at least for him?
I did. I had contact with him, and I had contact with Tommy Morgan, who is now the only surviving Twilight Zone composer.
Oh my God! Wow.
He's in his mid to late 90s now, and he actually wrote the preface for my book, and he also has a signed copy. But unfortunately, pretty much, it's kind of like that book, All My Friends Are Dead. Pretty much all of them.
I just saw that not very long ago. I don't know if listeners may or may not know that I, about a year ago, became a grandfather. So I've kind of been re-exposed to a lot of kiddie things. And that book somehow at some point showed up around here. And it's hilarious, man. It's a wonderful book. Kind of like that other book, which I keep meaning to buy for my son and his wife, that Go the Fuck to Sleep book.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yeah, I think there's an audio version with Samuel L. Jackson that's just wonderful.
It's priceless.
It really is, and parents need that.
They do.
They didn't have that when I had kids. That wasn't around. We were stuck with like the old school, innocent stuff. So the proliferation of the F word in modern language is kind of wonderful, actually.
It really is.
And that's why we have an explicit rating on this podcast. So did you say that Robert Drasnin, did he work on the 80s Twilight Zone?
He did. If I remember correctly, he also said it was a real pain in the behind and he hated doing it.
I mean, was he like doing something in production, or he just was like composing music?
I think he was doing a little bit of both.
Interesting.
And I remember he also mentioned something, but I don't exactly remember what, about the theme music that was played by the Grateful Dead.
Yeah. It's funny. I was a teenager when that came on, and I was obsessed with the original series at that point. So, I watched that thing every week, and I, videotaped it every week. At that point, it's like, it's Twilight Zone. It's wonderful. Everything's wonderful. It's interesting. I mean, over time, it's like, has that show aged well? I mean, it's I go back and forth on it. I mean, there are some episodes of the 80s Twilight Zone that are really, really good. There are some that aren't. In fact, next week, spontaneous promo for next week, we're covering the After Hours, which was, I don't want to say famously remade by the new Twilight Zone, maybe more infamously, because it's not great at all.
Oh, no, it's not. In fact, I saw it last week. For some reason, I think Chiller, it was the channel, had a 80s Twilight Zone marathon on July 3rd. My dad insisted on watching it. And I do not like the 80s Twilight Zone at all. They aired the remake of the the After Hours and the remake of Shadow Play.
Yeah. And it's not... Okay, so the Shadow Play remake, because I talked a little bit about this when I covered Shadow Play.
Right.
It's okay. I mean, it's not like... I would not call it, like, offensively bad. It's just like any of the remakes. It's like, why does this exist at all? Right. There's at no point have they ever remade a Twilight Zone that was superior to the original. I think the only thing for me that even... I don't want to say comes close because it doesn't, is when the UPN Twilight Zone did the sequel to It's a Good Life, which I think is actually pretty good. It's not, it's not as good as the original, but it's very interesting because, Bill Mumy is there and Cloris Leachman is there, and it kind of feels like an actual continuation of that story. Yeah. But these other ones that are just straight remake, I mean, the UPN series did The Eye of the Beholder, which why would you ever do that? Why would you touch that? But kind of how
I feel about cover songs. Some songs should just not be covered.
True.
And then there are some covers that I like better than the original. So
yeah. I mean, it's just one of those things. I mean, when these Twilight Zone revival series did a remake, I think that it's obviously that immediate connection to the original show, but it never works. I mean, all it ever did was made me want to go back and watch the original. I mean, it doesn't, it never made me think, oh yeah, screw the original. This is great. This is the new, this is the better, it just doesn't, it didn't happen. When they do original stuff on the 80s Twilight Zone, sometimes it's good. And we don't need to stay on this tangent for very long. But I just watched one today that I hadn't seen probably since the original broadcast, called Shelter Skelter, which is a bomb shelter thing. And the reason automatic promo, the reason I was watching it is because I was working on my notes for the episode where I cover the monsters we do on Maple Street and the shelter. So obviously we're on a bomb shelter thing, so I kind of thought, I should talk about that right there. And that one's not terrible. I mean, it's not great, but it's not terrible. But there are actually, I think there are some really good episodes of the 80s Twilight Zone. I just think that more often than not, it's just kind of mediocre.
Right.
And I think I think, it ultimately is just a footnote, in the Twilight Zone legend. It's maybe a slightly better footnote than the UPN version, because I think that one really sucked.
And it was also very, very short-lived because it sucked.
Yeah. I mean, there's a whole thing with, like, it was on UPN, and UPN was kind of a fledgling network that eventually kind of tanked and turned into something else. But yeah, I think if it had been really great, it probably would have lasted, and it didn't. Right. Okay. So anyway, I'll just end this tangent by saying I have found, as I'm working on the new episodes of the podcast, I keep running into the 80s Twilight Zone and the UPN Twilight Zone, which is weird. It just seems like I just keep bumping up against those. So yeah. So fans of the 80s Twilight Zone, keep listening, because I'm going to be looking at a number of those. So you're welcome in advance. So anything else of interest about the Moat Farm Murder? I actually wanted to talk a little bit about, its releases, because it's shown up a couple times on soundtracks. A lot of Herrmann's CBS library stuff came out on vinyl in the 80s.
Right.
There are 4 different volumes of various things, and there's one called the Outer Space Suite, and that one has 3 cues from the Moat Farm Murder. But I actually suspect that those 3 are probably multiple cues thrown together, but I don't know that for sure. Anyway,
more, but I'm not entirely sure.
It showed up later. A lot of this same stuff showed up on a couple of CDs. Bernard Herrmann at CBS, basically. But when it showed up there on CD, they had just kind of smushed it all together into one track, so it's like a suite.
Right.
Which makes it even harder. I know that the Moat Farm Murder score has 14 individual cues.
Yes.
But I actually tried one day, a couple of weeks ago, to figure out which ones were which, so I could identify them, to see if all of it was actually available, like on these soundtrack releases. I gave up because I couldn't. I couldn't figure it out. But the released version, whether you're looking at the suite that came out on CD or the vinyl, I think it ends up being about like 8 minutes long, which for a 30-minute radio drama, that's quite a bit of music. Maybe it's the whole thing. I don't know. So I've been buying some vinyl lately, and the Outer Space Suite in particular is that's like one of my holy grails. I really want that record, but it's expensive. I think there's one on eBay and it's like $90. It's like I can't justify that. My friend Bill has it because he, was buying records back in the day. So he's got a ton of Herrmann on vinyl. But I picked up a different record called Music from Radio and Television, which has some of his other stuff that from the CBS Music Library, including something called the Walt Whitman Suite,
right?
Which was a Norman Corwin thing, which I actually earlier talked about Norman Corwin. So hey, see, I'm tying it. I'm bringing it around. You see?
There you go.
See, people think that these the conversational episodes of the podcast are more spontaneous. They're not. This is all designed in advance. It's not. It's not at all designed in advance. So, Moat Farm Murder. Anything else on that?
No, I mean, I think that for the most part, when the cues are used in Twilight Zone, they're relatively cohesive.
Mhm.
There's a couple of instances where I know that they're kind of don't really make sense. But for the most part, they're really in kind of a very similar context every time they're used. It usually has to do with somebody either betraying somebody else or murder or somebody getting their just desserts.
Oh, I just thought of another one. The new exhibit.
Yes.
I think uses, and that's interesting actually because that one is about the curator of this collection of wax figures who are all based on historical murderers. So that that actually makes direct sense to use some of those cues in that episode because, I mean, it's murder.
Yeah. Exactly.
Oh my god.
And that stinger again is also used anytime one of the wax figures kills somebody.
Right. As long as we're talking about that, just really briefly, we see those murders happen, or at least we see the figures move. One's got an axe, one's got a knife, one's got a strangly rope, whatever. But then in the end, we're asked to believe that Martin Balsam committed these murders.
Right.
Even though we saw the wax figures coming to life. Any thoughts on that? That's always bugged me a little bit.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think in a lot of ways he's kind of the scapegoat for that. Because, I mean, really, who's going to believe that these wax figures could kill? It's kind of like Talkie-Tina, like,
Oh, okay, sure.
This doll is going to kill you. Or even in Caesar and Me, who's going to believe that this ventriloquist dummy is going to make somebody rob a bank? And so,
When I think of those three, he wanted to say in his image, and I know that's wrong. The new exhibit's the only one of those three where it's even suggested that, hey, this is all in your head. Like you are, your brain is fabricating this, and you're actually the one doing it. Right. Which in all three of those, actually that would be the logical. If you had to boil it down to logic, you would say, well, yeah, these people are crazy. This is all in their heads. They're the ones that are doing this stuff. I've personally never really decided on the new exhibit which way I go with it. I mean, I want to think that just because it's the Twilight Zone that these wax figures are actually coming to life.
right.
But then it just starts me down this whole rabbit hole of well, why are they doing that? Because they're so well sculpted that they somehow, the murderous impulse of the original murderers somehow lives on through the wax. I mean, I don't know.
I mean, there's so many things I think in the series that can't be explained.
Mm-hmm.
And that's kind of the beauty of it.
It absolutely is, and I don't know what it is about me. I just tend to overanalyze, so I know that I this is a fault where I sit there and I try to figure it out logically. It's like, well, why? How? And I find myself on the episode I just recorded for I Shot an Arrow into the Air and Rip Van Winkle. I keep reminding myself suspension of disbelief. I got to suspend that disbelief. But I think that
I'm having with Twin Peaks.
Oh yeah, suspension. I don't. It's more like just dangling out over a canyon with that one because it's just I don't know. Listeners, if any of you guys are Twin Peaks fans, we're recording this right after I think the 9th new episode. Yes. Is it just aired?
Yep.
So obviously we're halfway through it. There's still 9 to go. So I'm really trying to not make a judgment, but it's challenging. It's especially because I had just very recently rewatched the original series. So it's kind of hard for me reconciling that with the new series because it's just so different.
Oh yeah.
But I'm gonna stay suspended, and I'm not gonna make up my mind. And you and I will talk about this after after it ends. we'll see. We'll see how we feel. But so that's the Moat Farm Murder. So once we get off here, Doc, I am going to play the Moat Farm Murder. Nice. A little confession, I have never actually listened to the whole thing.
Really?
I've heard little chunks of it, and I've obviously heard the music a million times. But yeah, so I'm looking forward to this too, because I'm going to listen to it right along with everybody else.
Sweet.
You know, every time I think, okay, this will just be like a 10-minute one.
It's like 50.
And I don't blame you. It's not your fault. It is me, because I'm driving and I just keep like going down weird roads.
But the other thing is that we go on tangents that kind of relate.
Sure. I've never had a complaint.
We're not talking about the pen that your dog got a hold of last week and wound up getting ink all over her face. I mean, no.
No, that my dogs just eat Dave Scow books. So he just the other day he had posted that again somewhere, where that picture of my Outer Limits companion that my dog had chewed up.
Oh my God.
And I was like, oh my God, I forgot all about that. It was so wonderful. They can't get at my books. They're up on shelves now. I don't know why that one was not. I think at the time where we were living, things were kind of all over the place. And I think I had that one out because I was at that time working on the Outer Limits blog. And I think that I had left it laying somewhere. And one of them, we don't know who, one of them got a hold of it. So apparently the Outer Limits companion is tasty.
Apparently. Good paper.
Yeah. It's actually terrible paper. The first edition of that book is like pulpy. It's crap.
It's falling apart.
It is. It's well, mine was, but Scout sent me a new copy when that happened, so I've got a pristine edition of that first edition. And then I bought the second edition too, and I'll buy the third if it ever comes out.
Yeah, really.
It's supposed to be happening at some point.
The question is, how old will we be when it happens?
No. Well, it's the same as Zickery is supposed to be working on the Twilight Zone Companion 3rd edition. And I think he said, I saw somewhere he said it was coming out around Christmas time, but it's only going to be an ebook. Because it's going to have a bunch of multimedia stuff. And it's like, okay, that's nice, but I want a book, man. I want an actual physical book. Because one of my biggest gripes about that book is that it just is too cursory too often. And this is a little arrogant, but I mean, I remember making an observation. I don't know if it was in conversation or if I actually wrote this somewhere on the internet and it's there forever, that it's weird to me because especially in the 5th season, he just breezes through it and you get like 10-word little comments. It's like, I've written more about Ring-a-Ding Girl than Mark Zickery. It's just, for better or worse, like I've written more about it than he has. And it's like, and I'm hoping that if this 3rd edition ever comes out, that he really dives in. I mean, what I would like to see is a Twilight Zone companion that is as intricate and deep as the Outer Limits companion. Yeah. Because that damn book, it's everything you ever wanted to know and more. There's just, I don't know how you could add anything to that.
Things you didn't know you wanted to know.
Right. But it's such a great... the Outer Limits companion, I think what's so great about it is it's never dry. It's like Scow has this way of writing, and I actually think that he might have been an inspiration for the way I write, is there's just this sort of a sarcasm just kind of brimming under there, and it's... Yeah. But I love Dave Scow. Anyway, well, Doc... it's great to be back. It's great to have you back. It's great to be doing this again. I appreciate you so much. We're gonna get all weepy here.
I know.
Cue the violins. But yeah, no. I mean, you've been wonderful. You've always been so helpful, and and you continue to be helpful, and I just appreciate that.
Oh,
so thank you. All right. I will talk to you soon.
Alrighty.
All right. Bye now. Bye. Dr. Reba Wissner is the author of A Dimension of Sound, Music in the Twilight Zone, and we will control all that you hear, the outer limits, and the aural imagination. One of the joys of doing this podcast has been being able to spotlight the music of the Twilight Zone, something not a ton of people care about, much less even notice. I've been fascinated by the music of the show since I first got the first two Varese Saraband soundtracks on cassette in 1991, I think. So it's important to me to give it some attention. Reba has been instrumental in that aspect of the podcast, so I just appreciate the hell out of her. So thanks, Doc. I debated which version of the Moat Farm Murder to share tonight. The original Charles Laughton version from 1944 or the 1946 Mercury Summer Theater version with Orson Welles. I decided on the original. The Welles version is easy to find online if you're so inclined. So now, dear listener, close your eyes and let your mind provide the imagery as Norman Corwin brings to life the Moat Farm Murder with original music by Bernard Herrmann. Unless you're driving, that is, in which case you should definitely keep your eyes open.
Columbia presents Corwin. Tonight, Norman Corwin brings you Charles Laughton and Elsa Lanchester in the Moat Farm Murder, with an original score composed and conducted by Bernard Herrmann.
This program is an authentic word-for-word confession of a murder committed by an Englishman named Dougal 41 years ago. Except for occasional dialogue indicated in the confession itself, what you'll hear in Mr. Laughton's direct narration is exactly what the murderer told the British police and is reproduced in his very own words. Charles Laughton and Elsa Lanchester in the Moat Farm Murder.
And now, if the stenographer's ready, we'll proceed with Mr. Dougal's confession from where we left off in our last session. Go ahead, Mr. Dougal.
I did not find Miss Holland as generous as I expected. And as I didn't have very much money, I suggested that we should buy a farm. I should think we looked at about a dozen farms altogether, but none of them suited me until I came across the Moat House farm. It was just the place I wanted. When she complained of its loneliness, I said that that was its charm, because we should be able to live there together away from any inquisitive strangers.
I see.
Everything went all right up to the time that the farm was purchased. And I certainly did intend that the deed should be made out in my name, but to this Miss Holland would not consent. And therefore all the visions I had had of getting hold of the farm, turning her out and selling it, melted away.
Mm-hmm.
Finding she was so tight-fisted, I began to think of various schemes to put her out of the way. But I thought I'd wait a little while and see if she altered. I think she was naturally very close. It was a strange thing to find a woman so close, because otherwise she was not so bad. And she'd often try, when I was miserable or down in the dumps, to cheer me up by playing or singing to me. She was old-fashioned in a lot of her ways. When I suggested that she should buy herself new dresses and wear more fashionable clothes, she said she'd wear what she liked.
I will wear what I like. Is that clear? I don't want to be in the fashion. And in my view, if two people were fond of each other, it doesn't matter what they wear, does it?
She had a lot of clothing belonging to her aunt. And she was always twisting, mending, and altering a lot of old dresses that I wouldn't have given house room to. She was rather snappy at times. If I didn't quite agree with everything she said, she'd bounce out of the room.
Very well. If that's how you feel.
Perhaps toward the evening, she'd get over her temper, and then she'd come downstairs and plead for forgiveness.
Oh, Herbert.
What is it?
I'm sorry about losing my temper.
How are you now?
Yes, I'm afraid I was sharper than I need have been. Do you forgive me?
Oh, yes, Cecily, so long as you realize that I was right in the matter.
I suppose you were right, Herbert.
Then let's forget it.
It's only my state of nerves, really, that make me give way to such temper.
I didn't mind these fits of temper because they gave me an opportunity of clearing out and having a good day and a game or two of billiards. I was drinking very heavily then because I'd made up my mind by this time either to get a lump sum out of her and clear out, or put her out of the way and have the lot. I made up my mind at last to put her out of the way. I used to sit and think about it for hours because, although I'd done a lot of things during my life, I couldn't quite make up my mind to go so far as to murder her. I tried to get her to make a will, leaving everything to me, while I made one also, leaving everything to her.
But why do that?
It only seems to me the right and proper thing to do.
Well, I've already made my will.
You have?
Yes, and I don't intend to alter it.
All this caused me a lot of trouble. I used to sit for hours, conjuring up all kinds of schemes to get rid of her. But this time I got positively to hate her. When we actually moved it to the farm, I'd definitely decided what I should do. I thought that a very good place to bury her would be the ditch. That was why the very first week we were at the farm, I gave orders for it to be filled in. Although she knew nothing about my purpose, she came out of the house and stood by the side of the ditch whilst I and Pilgrim, the labourer, were discussing the best way to fill it up. The elder tree stood by the side, and I can see her there now, holding one of the boughs and arguing against the ditch being filled in until proper arrangements had been made for draining it another way.
I don't think you know what you're about, Herbert.
Cecily, my dear, I know very well what I'm doing.
But I have a right to my opinion, and more than a right to discuss what is being done on this farm. Why, this labourer here knows more than you do about it.
I prefer that we leave him out of it.
Pilgrim! Pilgrim!
Yes, ma'am?
How do you think this should be done?
Well, ma'am, I think the proper way to do the job is to make the new drain first and then fill in the ditch.
There. You see, Herbert?
I see nothing of the sort. I'd made up my mind what I was going to do with her, so it didn't suit my purpose to accept his advice. And I insisted on the work being commenced at once, although I didn't want the filling in completed. I don't think I should have done it had I not been drinking heavily. But the more drink I had, the more determined I became, and the easier it looked. I wanted money very badly then, and I made one final appeal to Miss Holland to let me have some money, but she refused.
I know very well what you want that money for, to spend it on drink. Well, you can't have it.
She was so close that she wouldn't trust me with even the wages to pay the farm hands. And at last I was pushed in such a corner that I determined to finish the matter that week. Of course, I knew all about firearms. When the wind was in a certain direction, I fired the revolver off several times in the coach house in order to see if anyone heard it while they were in the back of the house. I was very glad to find that nobody heard any report, and I placed the revolver, fully loaded, and some cartridges, on a shelf in the coach house, ready for me when I wanted it. It was there 7 or 8 days before I finally used it.
Just a moment, Mr. Dougal. What about the testimony of the servant girl that you made advances to her late one night?
What that servant girl says about going to her door is about right. Although I think she exaggerates a little. I'd had a skinful of brandy that night. Well, Miss Holland and I had quite a row. She accused me of a lot of things. Of course, I declared that the servant's story was a lie from top to bottom. But she stuck up for the girl, and she made herself so ill that she cried very nearly the whole of one day. On Friday morning, we'd made it up. I'd got her round her by lunchtime, and we made up our quarrel, and she'd forgiven me. And that was why we thought of going for a drive. As it was a beautiful night, we let the horse walk slowly home. I should think it was about 8:15 when we got back to the farm. When I'd taken the horse out, I thought she'd go in the house. But instead of that, she made some remark about its being a beautiful moonlight night. I'd pushed the trap into the coach house by this time. I stepped up on the side of the trap, reached down the revolver, and as Miss Holland stood just near the door looking at the moon, I shot her. She dropped just like a log. And then I pulled her into the coach house. If I live to be 1,000 years old, I shall never forget the feeling as I caught hold of both her hands and drew her along until I got her into the coach house. All kinds of things came into my mind. My heart seemed almost to stand still as I put my hand inside her dress to feel if her heart was beating. Of course, I knew that she was dead. And yet I don't know what made me do it, but I knelt down on one knee and pulled her head and asked her to speak to me if she could. Cicely, Cicely, speak to me. Cicely, don't you see me? Cicely. I didn't think this was of much use, and why I did it I can't tell even now, but I thought for a moment that she might come to because there was no blood about and I wasn't quite certain where the bullet had struck her. Great beads of perspiration began to run down my back. When I left the coach house, I had a most peculiar sensation, as if someone was following me. I thought the doors of the coach house had opened, and she was walking out after me. I could almost feel her touch me. And as true as there's a God in heaven, sir, I was ready to drop. I must have stood there some seconds, and then I put my hand into my pocket and drew out the revolver and turned around and looked straight at the coach house. I couldn't quite get out of my mind nor get rid of the feeling that something or someone besides myself stood between me and the coach house. So I leveled up the revolver and stood there with it in my hand. I don't think I could have uttered a word to have saved my life. My tongue was like a great ball of fire, and I quite hurt myself trying to get some saliva to moisten my mouth and my parched tongue. Oh, then I remembered how silly it was, and of course there was no one, and I put the revolver back into my pocket and walked into the house. We usually kept some brandy in a decanter in the sitting room. So I pushed the door open, and I picked up the decanter without waiting for a glass. I think I must have gulped down half of its contents. Every few minutes I broke into a violent perspiration. Then my tongue would become so hot and my lips so dry that I had to rub them with my fingers to get some feeling into them. I seized the brandy bottle again. I had another good swig at it. And I don't know why, but I thought it might be all a mistake, that perhaps after all the bullet hadn't struck her, that she'd only fainted and she might come to if I gave her some brandy. So I caught hold of the decanter and walked across with it in my hand to the coach house. I couldn't make up my mind for a second or two to go inside. I called out, "Cicely! Cicely!" Then I thought what a fool I was, because everything had gone just as I'd planned it and there was not a living soul near. I had nothing to fear. Then I went into the coach house, and it was dark, and I pushed the door further open so that some of the light from the moon would come in. She was in exactly the same position as I'd left her. So I knelt down and poured some of the brandy over her face, thinking perhaps it might revive her. But really I knew this was impossible, because she was dead. I tried to sit her up, but she fell back, and I knew all was over then. Of course, I had arranged everything, and I'd mapped out days before where I was going to bury her, but I sat down and began thinking over new schemes, and every few minutes I kept touching her and feeling her pulse and speaking to her. I tried to smoke a cigar, but I had to light it a dozen times because I forgot all about it. It went out. I made up my mind that it'd be best not to put her in the ditch, but to take her away and bury her somewhere else. So I took off her hat and her veil and the jacket she was wearing, and I picked her up in my arms and walked down by the side of the little moat. Her head was leaning over my shoulder. As I carried her along, I wished there was a great big furnace there that I could put her in and watch her burn. I thought of cutting her up into pieces and putting her into the moat, but I thought of the time it'd take me, and I was afraid of being interrupted. Somehow I wanted to bury her out of sight, and yet I wanted to keep her by the side of me. So I went back to the field and picked her up again and carried her over to one of the haystacks. I found then that she was getting cold and stiff, for there was a strong breeze blowing and it was rather a cold night. It was a horrible sight to see her lying on the ground, and before I picked her up the last time, I wished that she was alive again, because I thought, after all, she hadn't done me any harm. So I knelt down and kissed her once or twice. All the good times we had seemed to come back to me. And I remembered once or twice when I had been queer through the drink. She'd nursed me and tried to get me well. But after all, it was a bit hard to do her in. Then I began to think what had happened to me if she was found. I thought I'd hide her in the haystack for a few days. Finally, I made up my mind that I'd get rid of her once and for all. I went and got the fork, and I carried some straw and laid it down at the bottom of the ditch. I think the brandy then began to have some effect upon me, and I grew more brutal. And I began to think of the way she'd nagged me and the difficulty I had in getting money from her. Caught hold of her hand and pulled the ring off her finger. She was very fond of this ring. It had been given to her by the only man I really believe she ever loved. I asked her to tell me the story one day, and she did. She said that while her aunt kept a ladies' school at Liverpool, she used to help her in the management.
And whilst doing so, she grew very fond of the brother, one of the pupils, a midshipman who had returned home from a voyage. The young man and I fell in love with each other, almost at first sight, and he vowed that he would make his fortune abroad and return and marry me. He had some relatives in the West Indies, and he went out there shortly afterwards and took up some kind of post. He used to write letters to me. But just when everything looked bright, and he was drowned through the upsetting of a yacht, and his body was not recovered for some days. When it was found, the ring that he wore on his finger was taken off and sent home to his parents. Who gave it to me?
Well, I took that ring off her finger. And just as I did so, a stray moonbeam came through a cloud and played about her face. It made me quite shudder. Also, I put my hand down and caught hold of the gold cross that was round her neck and wrenched it off, snapping the chain on which it used to hang round her neck. I had another drop of brandy then, and I turned her over, put my hand in her pocket and took her purse. I don't think I knew what I was doing then. I picked her up in my arms just as you'd carry a baby, sir, and laid her on the straw. Then a change came over me. The more brandy I drank, the more brutal and wicked I seemed to get. One minute I wanted to kiss her, and the next minute I wanted to pitch a lot of mould over her. But at last I made up my mind that I'd bury her and get her out of sight. I thought of what had happened but a few days before, when she stood by the side of the ditch talking to Pilgrim and myself about filling in the ditch.
I don't think you know what you're about, Herbert.
I thought perhaps, unless I covered her over, the fowls would scratch away the straw, so I got some brambles and twigs and pieces of wood, and I stretched them over her body. And I went back to the house and had some more brandy, and then I went to bed. I couldn't sleep. And I got up and walked around the farm and down to the road and back again. I couldn't keep my eyes off the ditch. I'm sure I aged that night 20 years. I never closed my eyes the whole night long. And I couldn't keep still or rest for even a quarter of an hour. I tried to read. I tried to write. I tried to sleep. But it was all in vain. Not one single moment's peace did I have. I'm sure that if I went once to the ditch, I went 20 times. I now began to wish that all traces of this night were obliterated. I was tempted once or twice to pitch the ring and the cross into the moat, but somehow I couldn't do it. Well, one of the first things I did was to open Miss Holland's desk and go through a lot of her papers in order to find out, if possible, how much money she had. She kept her accounts very neatly, but I was very disappointed when I found that she was not worth more than £6,000 or £7,000. I thought perhaps Miss Holland had some more cash concealed about the place somewhere. So I turned over her trunks and boxes, but I couldn't find any, and I certainly did feel somewhat disappointed. I used to have terrible dreams at night. As I went about the house, I used to fancy I could hear Miss Holland's voice. I think if I went once to look at that ditch, I went 100 times a day. And I'm sure if anyone had watched me, they'd have grown suspicious and thought there must be something under that ditch.
Yes? Go on, Mr. Dougal.
I come now to a terrible part of my life because, however clever one may be, and however well one's plans are being carried out, there always is the suspicion lurking at the back of your head that you may have made one little blunder which will lead to the truth coming out. It's all very well to try and drown your thoughts in drink. And as sure as I'm alive on this earth, no one tried harder than I did to banish entirely from my mind all recollections of that terrible night. But I found that it was physically impossible.
What a beautiful moonlight night.
It didn't matter where I was or who was with me. The moment there was a lull in the conversation, the moment my attention was taken from anything, away back to the farm went my thoughts. As sure as I stand here, sir, I can swear I've gone into the coach house hundreds of times, expecting to see her lying on her back as I dragged her in there. But nothing would make me believe that she wasn't until I'd gone in and seen for myself.
Herbert.
I did this 2 or 3 times a day sometimes. And all the time, I knew that I'd buried her in the ditch and she was still there. I've tried to reason with myself times out of number, but it was no good. I had to go into that coach house and see for myself that she was not there. Sometimes, when I've been walking along or sitting in a railway carriage, I've closed my eyes and tried to make myself believe that it was all a dream, and that Miss Holland wasn't dead, and that it was some foolish thought that I'd got into my mind. I've got up and said to myself, oh, you're not a murderer, old man, whatever else you may be. And I sat down again and I felt much better and more satisfied. But unfortunately, this didn't last very long.
Herbert.
A few minutes later, my mind travelled back to May the 19th. And there I could see myself loading the revolver in the morning. putting it on the shelf, and then taking the pony out of the trap.
What a beautiful moonlight night.
And standing on the step and shooting her. Why, 3 years after she'd been dead, I could close my eyes and still feel that I had her in my arms. I could still feel her head hanging over my shoulders. And I could still see her face as I laid her in the ditch. At one time, drink would send me to sleep. And perhaps for a few hours I'd forget all about the Moat Farm. But as time went on, I found it impossible to get a night's rest. Then I took to walking in my sleep. And I thought I should have gone mad when I found out I was a somnambulist. I remember one night I returned from London, and I don't think I was quite sober. And after having a good look round, I went to bed, I should think about 11 o'clock. I remember quite well taking off my clothes and getting into bed. But just before daybreak, I suddenly came to myself, and I found that I was standing by the side of the ditch, and that a spade was in my hand. I was in my nightshirt, and I'd got out of the bedroom, walked down the stairs, opened the door, crossed over the Moat Bridge, gone into the coach house, and then gone to the grave with the spade in my hand. I think I must have been standing there a long time, because I was very cold and my nightshirt was wet with dew. I shook from head to foot and my teeth chattered. I was aching in every limb when I awoke, so I pitched the spade back into the coach house and went back to bed. And there I lay awake, counting the hours. I was really afraid of myself, and I thought that one of these mornings the labourers would come in and find me standing there, and I thought of all kinds of methods to prevent myself being found there. The only way I could prevent myself walking out to the ditch in my sleep was locking the gate at the entrance of the Moat Bridge. I put a bit of chain around it. Before I went to bed, I used to see that it was padlocked. Although this did not prevent me walking in my sleep, it stopped me going out to the ditch, because I used to go right up to the gate, and as it was locked, I feel certain I used to turn round and go back to bed. I know I did this, because one day the gate was painted white. When I woke up one morning, I found my hands covered in white paint, which showed that I'd been down to the gate and tried to open it. I got very ill about this time.
Tell me, Mr. Dougal, when did you first begin to sense danger? Before or after the investigation was started?
When the superintendent called at the farm, I began to see danger, and I thought it best to leave the farm once and forever. I didn't know where I was going when I left it, and sometimes I didn't seem to care whether they found me out or whether they didn't. I was so tired of it all. And yet the moment I thought of a hand being placed on my shoulder, I conjectured up all kinds of pictures. I have seen myself tried. I have heard myself sentenced. And I felt myself standing on the scaffold with the rope round my neck. But at times, as I sat in my cell, I often thought that after all, I was only living a life of misery, and it would be better to end it.
You have been listening to Charles Lawton and Elsa Lanchester in the Moat Farm Murder, adapted by Norman Corwin from a true confession and directed and produced by him as the 18th in his current series of broadcasts. Bernard Herrmann composed and conducted the musical score. Heard on the program tonight with Mr. Lawton and Miss Lanchester was Raymond Lawrence. From New York, next week at this same time, Columbia presents Corwin's production of The Fourth Decade by the young American poet Norman Roston. Dick Cutting speaking. This is CBS, the Columbia Broadcasting System.
I've got to give a quick shout out to Tom Elliott of the Twilight Zone podcast. He's presented a few vintage radio productions on his show, so I sort of stole the idea from him. But he's never done the Moat Farm Murder, though, so hopefully he won't feel that I've stepped on his toes. In any case, dear listener, my larceny is your game, right? That'll do for now. Catch us on Facebook and Tumblr at ZonePod, or drop us a line old-fashioned like via email at zonepod@gmail.com. Next week's episode will drop in 7 days, so come on back, y'all. And kids, play nice.
Between light and shadow.